Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the time zone you're all in. Welcome to the fourth KDI School Development Talks Series virtual event. My name is G.A. Park from the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, and I will serve as the virtual MC for today's webinar. Now, before we begin, please kindly note that today's webinar is currently being live streamed through KDI School's YouTube channel and is also being recorded for knowledge sharing purposes. Please also note that today's webinar will be uploaded through KDI School's K-Developedia website. For today's event, distinguished speakers from India and the World Bank will give insightful presentations on India. English, Korean simultaneous interpretation is also being provided for today's event, so please set the language interpretation option according to your preference through the Zoom setting below. Also, please keep your mic muted when you're not speaking, but if you have any questions and comments during the presentations, please leave them with your name and affiliation in the chat room, and we will cover them during the Q&A session after the presentations. Now, I would like to proceed the opening of the event by inviting our distinguished speakers to deliver their opening and welcoming remarks. First, Dr. Uk Son, Associate Dean of the Office of Development Research and International Cooperation, and professor at KDI School, will deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you.
Professor Son, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah. Mr. Surinder Bhagat, Deputy Chief of Mission at Embassy of India in Seoul. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers and participants on Zoom and YouTube. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. On behalf of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, I'd like to welcome everyone to the fourth 2022 KDI School Development Talks webinar series. Thank you so much for your interest and participation to today's event. I believe most of participants are familiar with the KDI School, but for those joining us new today, I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce KDI School and the mission of our webinar series. KDI School was founded as an affiliated educational body of the Korea Development Institute, the first government-led research institute in socio-economic policy. Established in 1997, KDI School has educated more than 5,000 alumni from 140 countries with the mission of fostering the next generation of global leaders. And a total of 46 Indian nationals have graduated and attending KDI School. Adding to that, KDI School has been working with the LBSNAA, a Civil Service Training Institute on Public Policy and Public Administration in India, for training more than 1,500 Indian administrative service officers since 2007. Along with our dedication to fostering global leaders, our mission is to share Korea's development experience and public policy strategies to support partner countries to better identify policy alternatives and solutions to contribute to more fruitful development path. KDI School's Development Talk Series is one of our efforts to share knowledge in light of KDI School's mission. This series aims to support our goal and mission by hosting webinar series on 5 countries. Actually, more than 5 countries selected among Korea's 27 priority partner countries. The past development talks webinars had informative and lively discussions focusing on 8 Korea's priority partners countries: Colombia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Egypt, Russia, and Rwanda, Philippines, and Bangladesh, and India today. We are here today to discuss India. India, as you all know, one of the top 10 largest economies in the world, with an extensive entrepreneurial culture and a world-class scientific community. It has now emerged as a global player as its integration into the global economy and has been accompanied by economic growth over the past decade. Since 2000, India has made a remarkable progress in reducing poverty, and between 2011 and 2015, more than 90 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty. Despite its economic slowdown since the outbreak of COVID-19, India is considered as a dominant player in the globe, one of the most dynamic regions in the world by offering immense business opportunities in its growing market. India and Korea established diplomatic relations in 1973, celebrating the 50th anniversary next year. 2015, the Korean government has prioritized ties with India and elevated its bilateral relation with India to special strategic partnership as part of its broader plan to bridge the gaps in terms of diplomatic, strategic, trade, and cultural ties. Moreover, trade and economic relations between the two countries have grown significantly over the past decade, and India and Korea are seeking to expand a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with an ambition to increase bilateral trade to $50 billion before 2030. During the meeting between Indian External Affairs Minister Subrahmanyam Jaishankar and the Korean Foreign Minister Jin Park on 3 weeks ago, on July 8th, the two sides agreed to make active efforts to for the substantial development of the special strategic partnership between two countries, and hope for a meaningful partnership and cooperation marking the 50th anniversary next year. This webinar would not have been possible without KDI School's Global Alumni Network. I sincerely appreciate alumni's continued interest and support for the school throughout their time and participation. So in this regard, I'd like to convey special thanks to our distinguished speakers, Ms. Somaya Ikubar, Case Management Associate at Clinton Health Access Initiative, Mr. Dhruv Sharma, the Senior Economist at the World Bank, and Mr. Ranjit Ghosh, Senior Economist at the World Bank, for participating in today's webinar. I believe today's webinar will provide learning opportunities for everyone through discussions on current policy responses to COVID-19. I also look forward to live discussions and various suggestions regarding the direction of development cooperation with India. Again, we would like to thank Mr. Surinder Bhagat, all of the three distinguished speakers and online participants for your precious time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the insightful message, Professor Son. Next, congratulatory remarks will be delivered by Surinder Bhagat, Deputy Chief of Mission at Embassy of India in Seoul. The floor is yours, Mr. Bhagat.
Thank you, Ms. Park. Dr. Son, Associate Dean, KDI School of Public Policy and Management, faculty members of KDI, experts from the government, representatives from Korean research institutes and Korean international cooperation agencies, distinguished speakers participating in this webinar, and dear students. Annyeong Hashimnika, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to congratulate KDI School of Public Policy and Management for organizing this webinar series and choosing India as a focus country. I'm glad to note the presence of domain experts in this webinar who will share their perspectives on India in a more elaborate manner. As Professor Dr. Son just mentioned, India and Korea share special strategic partnership with deep-rooted engagement in the realm of political affairs, commerce and investment, science and tech, fourth industrial revolution, technologies, defense and security, culture, people to people, you name it, and we have a very, very active agenda of cooperation. Even during the last 2 years of pandemic, the leadership of the two countries remained in close contact with each other, and they were sharing perspectives and as to how to deal with the emerging crisis, especially disruption to the global supply chains. As you all know, India is also known as the pharmacy of the world and has been supplying vaccines to a number of other countries through bilateral route, multilateral channels, and also through United Nations platform called COVAX. Indian economy, like other major other economies of the world, was adversely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as per the macroeconomic indicators show, India and Korea have emerged as some of the few countries which are which have done really well on the global economic horizon, and increased economic output and positive growth projection by more than one international agency. And I think my other speakers will dwell in more greater details on this aspect. In fact, what the data in front of me suggests that IMF has projected India to grow at 8.2% in the current financial year. World Bank estimates are at 7.5%, and the Indian Reserve Bank has pegged this growth at 7.2%. Now, this is despite the ongoing war in Europe and the early signs of slowdown being witnessed in several other countries. Now, in my view, what works in India's favor is its growing domestic market, huge middle class with considerable purchasing power, demographic dividend, a committed and business-friendly government, and a very strong startup ecosystem in the country. This is also evident from the strong investor confidence in the Indian economy. Now, one important data which is reflective of this strong confidence is that in the last 2 years, that is from 2020 and 2021, India has received a cumulative of $164 billion of foreign investments in the country, and has emerged as a preferred investment destination. Talking about the pharmaceutical sector in India, which has played a key role in ensuring early and quick recovery, I think we all know that the pharma sector in India is quite robust, and we also have a deep expertise in IT, high internet penetration, which has actually, all this has enabled the government to cushion the shock of pandemic by deploying these modern age technological tools to tackle the pandemic. Made in India vaccines ensured fast production, while a decisive government intervention made effective and efficient rollout of the vaccination program in the entire length and breadth of the country. The Indian pharmaceutical industry, which is currently valued at $41.7 billion, is expected to grow to $120 billion industry by 2030, and is currently exporting to over 190 countries worldwide. On the technological aspect, the government of India launched a Arogya Setu app to combat COVID. This app is basically meant for early identification and prevention of potential risk of infection and identify potential hotspots. This app has 217 million users and can be downloaded from Android, iOS, and other platforms. This mobile app has played a critical role in identifying first and second degree contact with a COVID positive person and alerting the registered user about the information and rendering timely medical assistance. I think it is mainly due to the proactive policy interventions made by the government at various levels and sectors which have stood us in good stead in our fight against COVID. The pandemic exposed critical gaps in our health infrastructure, which the government was quick to identify and plug. The entrepreneurial spirit of Indian people and businesses, as well as the support of partner countries like ROK, I think helped a lot to overcome the negative impact of COVID-19, especially during the second wave in the middle of last year. Here, I would also like to specifically mention the invaluable support which we got from the Korean government in terms of essential medical supplies like oxygen cylinders and ventilators, It's not only the Korean government, but also some of the big Korean companies like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, POSCO. They also chipped in and provided us with whatever they could at that point of time. In fact, Korea has already pioneered the 3T strategy of testing, tracing, and treatment, and has shown the way by effective monitoring of contact tracing, coupled with stringent testing protocols and treatment. All this basically was a template for other governments also to follow and modify them according to their own requirements. Now, right from the inception, the government of India believed and acted on the philosophy that this whole menace of COVID-19 must be tackled in a collective manner. This also was resonated when UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called and said that no one will be safe until everyone is safe. In fact, only after 4 days of starting our vaccination program in January last year, India started exporting vaccines to other countries. And under our vaccine Maitri program, between January to March 2021, India has supplied 65 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines to 95 countries around the world. The supply was slightly disrupted during the second wave in India, but was later resumed. Also, under the framework of Quad Vaccine Partnership, India will be producing 1 billion COVID vaccines to be supplied in the Indo-Pacific region. As on date, India has supplied 325 vaccines to Cambodia, 200,000 vaccines to Thailand under this framework. Now, coming to the current COVID situation in the country, as on July 25, the number of active cases in India stands at around 152,000, and the daily cases are in the range of 18 to 20,000, which is well within the limit of our system to take care of. What also helps us a lot is the fact that more than 90% of our population has already received 2 doses of vaccination. In fact, recently we achieved the important milestone of administering 2 billion vaccine doses in India. Given the vastly improved situation in the country, India has also resumed scheduled international flight operations from March this year. And I'm very happy to inform all the viewers here that India and Korea direct flight connectivity was also resumed early in May this year. And now we have 3 airlines operating 7 flights per week between Korea and different destinations in India. India and Korea continued their cooperation even during the COVID pandemic. As I said earlier, the leaders of both the countries held regular interactions and discussed avenues to deepen cooperation, especially in the field of health. As part of Indo-Pacific countries, both India and Korea held regular conversations on COVID-19 cooperation at the vice minister level. During the pandemic period, we saw closer ties between the Indian and Korean companies also. Korean company MS Biosensor produced test kits through its subsidiary plant in Manesar in Gurugram near New Delhi as early as in April 2020. On the other hand, Korean company Hanmi Pharmaceutical and Enzichem Life Sciences will begin producing Zycov-D, the plasmid DNA COVID-19 vaccine developed by India's pharmaceutical firm Zydus Cadila. Now, there exists huge potential for cooperation between the 2 countries, especially in the field of vaccines and pharmaceuticals. India, with its world-class manufacturing facility and skilled human resource, can produce vaccines and medicines at mass scale, while Korea, with its strong R&D infrastructure and investment, presents a scenario where both the 2 countries can complement each other and come up with something much bigger. Already the 2 countries are discussing to sign an MOU between the health ministries for streamlining cooperation and exchanging experiences. I hope in today's session, our Korean audiences will learn more about the Indian experience of dealing with COVID pandemic from the experts directly. And finally, I would like to congratulate KDI once again for organizing this webinar. I look forward to the deliberations of this webinar. And once again, congratulate Dr. Son for organizing this webinar. Thanks a lot. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you for the informative message, Mr. Bhagat. Now, I am pleased to invite the first presenter of today's event, Ms. Somaya Ekubal. She is currently Case Management Associate at Clinton Health Access Initiative, and she will speak on assessing preparedness of national policies on mental health in the wake of COVID-19. Everyone, please welcome Ms. Somaya Ekubal. It's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. J, for your kind introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. annyeonghaseyo. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to KDIS for providing me this opportunity to discuss the pressing issues of the world. And KDI's development talk is definitely a great initiative. I hope these little steps will help us create a better environment and the world to grow. As you said, my topic for today is assessing the preparedness of national policies on mental health in the wake of COVID-19. So it's a collaboration and learning opportunities between India and South Korea. First of all, we will discuss the global and country-specific scenarios about mental health issues and how COVID-19 has exacerbated these issues and impacted essential mental health services around the world. We will also assess the preparedness of national policies and infrastructure across India and Korea, and explore opportunities for collaboration and learning between the two countries. So this is the data, if you see the slide, this is the data from Global Burden of Disease 2019, and it says that 970 million people are affected by mental illnesses around the world, which is 1 in every 8 people. So mental health disorders included here are depression, anxiety, bipolar, eating disorder, and schizophrenia. So due to widespread underdiagnosis, these estimates use a combination of sources, including medical and national records, epidemiological data, survey data, and meta-regression models. The distribution among different illnesses here is 301 million people are suffering from anxiety, which includes 58 million children and adolescents. Similarly, for depression, it is 280 million people, including 23 million children and adolescents, followed by 40 million of people suffering from bipolar disorder. 24 million people from schizophrenia and 14 million with eating disorder. And other social disorder accounts for 40 million people. To put in words, these are not just the stats, but when we think about it, these are millions of people at risk and in need of right mental health care and services. Next slide, please. The data here shows the distribution of different diseases in India and South Korea, where anxiety disorders measures to be the largest contributor to the mental health burden in both the countries, followed by alcohol use disorder, depression, drug use disorder, and bipolar disorder. And if you see, sadly, both countries have a worse suicide rate. India has like 12.7%, which is highest in the Southeast Asia, according to the 2019 data. And South Korea has suicide rate of 24.4%, which is highest in the OECD countries as per 2018 data. Next, please. How COVID-19 pandemic affected the mental health. As we know, COVID-19 has impacted various aspects of our lives, our working environment, personal losses, lost opportunities, fear, and uncertainties have caused a huge jump in increased rate of mental health illnesses. So according to the Global Burden of Disease 2020, where a systematic review of data was undertaken to assess the increase in the two major global burden of mental health, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, informs that major depressive disorder increased by 27.6% and anxiety disorder by 25.6% worldwide. So as per this study, decrease in mobility and daily COVID-19 infection rate was found to be the contributing factors for this increase. However, interestingly, the study showed that the daily excess mortality rates were not found to have a significant association with the increase for both the disorders. So if you see the data for both the countries, in India, the prevalence of major depressive disorder increased from 29.2 to 35%, and in South Korea from 10.1% to 13.6%. Likewise, prevalence of anxiety disorder in India changed from 32.3 to 36.6%. 36.4% in Korea. Yes, next slide, please. COVID-19 pandemic has affected the mental health services. Post the COVID-19 pandemic, countries across the world have reported widespread disruption of critical mental health services. As WHO calls in its term that there is a need of increased investment in chronically underfunded sector, which is mental health. The WHO survey of 130 countries depicts the sad reality of disruption in the access to mental health services worldwide due to COVID-19 and the increasing demand for the services. So over 60% of reported disruption to mental health services for vulnerable people, including children and adolescents, elderly, and women requiring antenatal or postnatal services. 67% saw disruption to counseling and psychotherapy, and 65% to critical harm reduction services, and 45% to opioid against maintenance treatment for opioid dependence. And around 3/4 reported at least a partial disruption to school and workplace mental health services. Next slide, please. So WHO recommends all countries to increase their national spending on mental health and allocate resources to mental health as an integral component of their response and recovery plans. It is also recommended to monitor the disruption so that it can be tracked and addressed accordingly. However, it would be interesting to understand more on what are the reasons of underspending of budget is and a reluctancy to increase the national spending. Are we undermining the importance of mental health, or is there a lack of research and data to inform such decisions at state level? Because investment in mental health is sure going to help the nation, because the studies show that every US dollar spent on evidence-based care for depression and anxiety returns $5. So the investment in mental health is sure to bring benefits to the nation in the long run, and this message needs to be enforced again and again to our government. To see the preparedness of national policies on mental health in the wake of COVID-19. In terms of policies, the first Mental Health Act in South Korea was enacted in 1995 with the purpose of contributing to the improvement of public mental health by preventing mental illness and prescribing necessary matters pertaining to the medical service and rehabilitation of mentally ill persons. Furthermore, the Korean government followed the suggestions of OECD investigating team that completely revised the Mental Health Act in 2017, and it was titled as Act on the Improvement of Mental Health and the Support for Welfare Services for Mental Patients. In India, the first Mental Health Act came in 1987, and this was redefined in 2017, titled as Mental Health Care Act 2017, to provide for mental health care and services for persons with mental illness and to protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of such persons during delivery of mental health care and services and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. So both the countries have mental health policies, but if you see the budget allocation, India spends 2.01% of the annual budget on health, of which a mere 0.8% is allocated for mental health for the budgeted year 2020 and 21. So in contrast, South Korea, in response to COVID-19 in 2020, increased its health spending to 8.41%, of which 3% is spent on mental health. South Korea had 126 mental hospital beds per 100,000 population in 2018. In comparison, India has a mere 4.35 mental hospital beds for 100,000 population 2020. And as per the International Board of Scientific Advisor, they suggest that there has to be 30 to 60 beds per 100,000 population, and that is the acceptable range. In terms of community infrastructure, in addition, South Korea has a network of community mental health centers focusing on prevention, counseling, and rehabilitation. In contrast, in India, among the public-supported medical institution, only medical colleges have been mandated to ensure reserved beds for mental health issue treatment. Next slide, please. This is about the mental health insurance. So in 2018, the Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India directed all insurance companies to provide health insurance for mental illness in line with Mental Health Act passed in 2017 with immediate effect. In national health insurance in South Korea provides universal healthcare coverage for the entire population, so irrespective of where the treatment is received. And also in South Korea, doctors use the International Disease Code of the WHO for prescription, insurance claims, and examination of disability ratings. In terms of telemedicine, India has a stronger telemedicine system. So in principle, telemedicine is banned in South Korea. However, the government has in recent years allowed limited telemedicines on a trial basis. In contrast, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare uses telemedicine as a key strategy with initiatives like National Medical College Network, National Telemedicine Network, and use of space technology for telemedicine, etc. in India. So India linked 50 government medical colleges to promote teleeducation, e-learning, and the online medical consultation by utilizing the connectivity provided by National Knowledge Network. So we also have a thriving private sector providing telemedicine services. Next slide, please. So collaboration and learning opportunities between India and South Korea. There are many good practices and lessons learned from both the countries, but to focus on a few, India can definitely learn more about providing the right kind of insurance from Korea to set proper guidelines and standard protocols to define mental health illness to ensure insurers can offer coverage without any ambiguity. In terms of telemedicine, Korea can learn and adapt from experiences of India, because telemedicine can be the potent answer to reach hard to reach places and serve in the times like pandemic. It can also enhance the accessibility of services and readiness of seeking help. So infrastructure related issue will long remain a hurdle in India given its huge population, and however, India needs to upgrade its health infrastructure in the longer run. India can also take lessons from Korea in terms of strengthening community-based mental health centers that will improve the services and accessibility of general population. India already has district mental health programs that aims to detect and treat patients within the community, but it needs to strengthen the implementation and services. Yes, next slide, please. Yeah. So apart from the policies and programs, what else can we do as an individual? So we cannot talk about mental health without highlighting the responsibilities we as an individual have. The amount of change we can bring by simply evolving our perspective and understanding on mental illnesses and well-being is huge. So as per the psychiatric journal, the stigma of mental illness is a universal. 2016 study on stigma concluded that there is no country, society, or culture where people with mental illness have the same societal value as people without mental illness. This statement in itself screams the discrimination and stigma around mental health at various levels. So according to APA, stigma is experienced at various levels, and we play a crucial role at all the levels. So the public stigma, this is our perception, the negative discriminatory attitude that we have about mental illness. The self-stigma is the perception of people have about themselves and their own condition, the negative attitude and the internalized shame. Whereas the institutional stigma is more systematic. It involves policies of government and private organizations that intentionally or unintentionally limit opportunities for people with mental illness. Examples like lower funding for mental illness research or fewer mental health services relative to other healthcare and lack of opportunities for everyone. So we can address the public stigma or the self-stigma by understanding mental health as a part of our overall physical health, and there is a need to seek help just like we would do for any illnesses. Once we realize this and work on our perspective, it becomes easier to advocate for mental health and demand for the fair share of policies, intervention, infrastructure, and services for mental health. I am very grateful for this platform and would like to take this opportunity to appeal to all the leaders, policy makers, and development workers to take note and bring mental health at every decision table and bring it to dialogue in every network, your home, workplaces, and wherever it matters. Because unless we raise our voices, the demand shall not be heard. Mental health will remain under the wraps and it will continue to be the silent killer of the humanity worldwide. And I really hope it shall change. I think that is all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the informative presentation, Ms. Equable, and we will collect the questions after the second presentation. So next, we will proceed straight to the next presentation, and I am pleased to invite the next speaker, Mr. Dhruv Sharma and Mr. Rangit Ghosh. So Mr. Dhruv and Mr. Ghosh are senior economists at the World Bank, and today they will speak about India development update. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Dhruv Sharma and Mr. Rangit Ghosh.
Thank you, Ms. Park, and thank you to the KDI for organizing and inviting us and giving us the opportunity to present. What I'll do now is I'll just share my screen so that we have our presentation. I think it should be visible.
Yes, we can see your slides. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'll begin and then I'll hand over to my colleague Rangit. Both of us are economists at the World Bank. We cover India, of course, and speakers before us mentioned India and how South Korea dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, both from a health perspective and there were references to how India and Korea also recovered from an economic perspective. And today we'll cover some of those aspects. So if we can begin now, there are a number of key messages on how India has performed over the past couple of years. You know, we know the growth story in India prior to the pandemic is one that's well known. Millions of people lifted out of poverty, and then COVID hit, and it hit the economy quite hard. What we've seen over the past fiscal year was that India's economy did recover. The recovery, however, was not as broad-based as perhaps one would have liked, and we'll come to the reasons why that was the case in a moment. India dealt with the third wave earlier this year. The economic impact of that third wave was minimal compared to the first and second waves, and that was largely because mobility restrictions which were put into place in the first two waves were not put at such a stringent level during the third wave. An important part of India's growth story in the past and of course now and going into the future, of course, is investment. Investment has exceeded and recovered to pre-pandemic levels. However, as I said, the recovery was not entirely broad-based, and there are some weaknesses on the consumption side, and we'll come to those details in a minute. The tragedy that sort of unfolded in Russia and Ukraine and the conflict that's ongoing there could impede the pace of India's recovery. It's having an impact globally as well, and that conflict has spillovers which are affecting many aspects of the economy as well. India's external performance, trade, imports, exports, both have recovered significantly over the past couple of years, and in particular, imports have grown very strongly, especially over the past 6 months or so. One area to keep a close eye on as a policymaker is on the prices side. Inflation, as is the case in many parts of the world, is elevated. Prices have risen significantly, and in India over the past few months, headline inflation, so the consumer prices have hovered just beyond where the India's central bank would have liked, above the 6% threshold. And as a result of that, and as a result of global pressures, a monetary policy has sort of shifted its focus to managing price pressures, even though growth is still something that macro policymakers are still focusing on as well. And finally, when it comes to fiscal policy, the revenue performance over the past fiscal year was quite robust, and that's helped to narrow the fiscal deficit, which had expanded as government support was extended during the crisis. Now, let me turn to how COVID has sort of affected the country. We can see quite clearly that the three sort of waves. Excuse me, the first wave in March and April 2020, and then the second one last year, the Delta wave, and finally Omicron as well. India's remarkable success when it comes to its vaccination strategy is also quite clear. Basically, close to 90% of the adult population is now fully vaccinated, and we are seeing quite a lot of progress when it comes to vaccination of those second and third doses as well as younger children and young adults as well. There has been a recent spike, but I think it's not as severe as what we saw last year and January as well. I mentioned that India's economy had recovered in the past fiscal year. And as I mentioned, part of that was due to a very successful vaccination strategy, and also targeted policy responses from economic policymakers. It's quite clear in the first year of the pandemic, the economy was hurt quite hard. Investment fell sharply, private consumption fell sharply, and you can see quite clearly on the two charts that I have on screen that both of those have recovered. The gray part of the top panel refers to investment, and you can see that investment led by a significant push and policy focus by the government has recovered strongly. Consumption, which is a light blue part of that panel, has also recovered, but it's really investment that has driven the robust recovery that we referred to. When we think about which sectors were hit particularly hard as a result of the pandemic, it's the high touch, high contact services sectors: tourism, hospitality, retail. These were hurt pretty badly during the crisis, and you can see that recovery in those sectors is underway and is quite robust. Similarly, we've seen quite a lot of positive news when it comes to the industry sector, and agriculture remained robust during the crisis, and that's the case at the moment too. When it comes to measuring the impact on mobility, was one of the responses that the government put in place, limiting the extent of the spread of COVID. And we can see now that some of the high frequency indicators of economic activity, which is retail, grocery, pharmacy, the number of passengers at various transit stations, all of that now has surpassed pre-pandemic levels. The bottom left panel shows what's going on in the manufacturing sector, the services sector, and you can see that over the past year or so, both of those sectors have crossed a threshold which as economists we look out for, and that threshold basically suggests that both of those sectors are now in expansionary territory. And not only have they surpassed pre-pandemic levels, activity in the services side and the manufacturing side has recovered to 10-year highs as well. So the recovery, which I keep saying is robust, we're seeing quite a lot of evidence on that front from a number of angles, from transport to retail to manufacturing to services, and finally GST collections have also been high and have recovered from the pandemic. You can see very clearly there were two sharp dips, which represent the poor performance of GST revenue collections during the first and second waves, and then robust recovery after that. And a large reason for those sharp dips was, again, a limitation on mobility, which of course affects economic activity. So all in all, there are quite a lot of positive signs. Now, I had mentioned at the start that the recovery is not broad-based. There are still some weaknesses. The pandemic exposed some fault lines, structural fault lines in the Indian economy, and that recovery, which hasn't been broad-based, has been particularly evident in India's labor market. While unemployment has fallen from when the first wave hit, and then there was an increase in unemployment, of course, during the second wave, we are still seeing weaknesses when it comes to demand for employment, which is guaranteed by the Indian government. And this is the bottom left panel. Prior to the pandemic, you can see that the average number of days in terms of work demanded by those, particularly in the rural and construction sectors, was on average just below 30 days a year. This is a rural employment guarantee scheme where households are able to avail employment if they don't have access to it. You can see that the average during the fiscal year 21 increased, and one would have expected that, as many people were affected by job losses and many workers had returned to rural areas. And that demand has fallen in the past fiscal year, but it is still higher than it was pre-pandemic levels. The consumer confidence index also continues to show that society is still worried about their incomes. They're worried about job prospects, and as a result, there have been changes, or they do anticipate changes in the amount of discretionary spending. All of this then leads us to see some weakness in that consumption component I referred to in my previous slide. Consumption is about 60% of the Indian economy. So this is an area that many economists are watching, including us. Now, I had mentioned earlier that the Indian economy is also facing some headwinds when it comes to price pressures. Headline inflation. Inflation, as most people see reported in the news and other places, is high, and in fact, it is higher than the central bank's target range, of 2 to 6%. In India, the headline inflation numbers for the past 6 months have been a lot higher. Well, not a lot higher, but they've been higher than that top part of that range. And this is not only the case for headline inflation, but also core inflation, which excludes some of the more volatile components. Food inflation is also high, and part of the reason for this is what is going on globally. We've seen fuel and energy prices rise significantly as a result of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Food prices have also been high due to supply disruptions. So all of that is now translating into these pictures that I'm showing. The bottom panel shows the wholesale price index, and there also you can see the impact, the sharp surge in prices of fuel and power, manufacturing as well, elevated. So all of these are input costs, which then of course lead to challenges for manufacturers, for industry, and so on. And this is something that policymakers are acutely aware of, and I'll come to the policy response to those in just a minute. After we have a quick sort of, I've got 4 panels here which provide a summary of how India's external sector has fared over the past couple of years. The story about India's trade is quite evident. The trade balance is a deficit at the moment, largely as a result of a slowdown in global economic demand, which has affected India's exports. And I mentioned that India's recovery over the past year has been as a result of a pickup in investment, which has meant that India's import bill has gone up, because India is a net exporter of capital. The changes in prices when it comes to fuel and energy have also contributed to that. We've seen foreign portfolio investment flows also fluctuate. In more recent times, we have seen some return, but that picture is changing on a monthly basis. More recently, we've seen some pressure on India's exchange rate. Over the course of this year alone, India's exchange rate, as compared to the US dollar, it's depreciated by about 7%. That in absolute terms, that sounds like a lot, but it places India in the middle of the emerging and developing market economy group. So it hasn't really performed worse than any others. It's right in the middle of the pack. India's foreign exchange reserves, which grew significantly over the past couple of years, providing India with a bit of a buffer. They've been depleted recently as the central bank has used them to manage volatility when it comes to exchange rate depreciation. Where India is today and compared to where it was in past crises, for example, global economic crisis, India is much better placed. A lot of its macro fundamentals are more robust. And there are significant buffers, which has allowed the Indian government to use them in a targeted fashion. I had mentioned that price pressures had resulted in a change in the policy response from the central bank, and we can see that, like many central banks all around the world, India's central bank has begun to raise its policy rate. It has removed a lot of the liquidity that was pumped into the economy as a result of the supportive measures that came into place when the pandemic first started. And now we're seeing an attempt to mop up that excess liquidity and also manage price expectations. Now, I'll turn to my colleague Rangeet to discuss what policymakers are doing on the fiscal side.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Am I audible? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, when India entered the COVID-19 pandemic in April 2020, there was a huge debate in India on how much the government should spend directly to counter the impact of the pandemic. So one thing that needs to be mentioned in general is that the government remained quite prudent in its fiscal response, but very wisely was able to target spending to areas which needed the most. And the chart below, on the panel below, shows that even though the general government deficit climbed up hugely, so the general government is the center plus the states, it climbed to nearly 13% of GDP. Actually, the targeted fiscal response of the union government was estimated around 3 to 4% of GDP. And the focus really was more on capital spending. So as you can see that the central government capital expenditure expanded at a much larger pace over FY 21-22. And that remains the focus now. And to help these, India introduced the goods and services tax. So it is a tax that aims to make India one market. So the uniform tax rates, indirect tax rates are levied across the country. GST revenue collections have been very strong, which has actually helped to achieve some fiscal consolidation, in that the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio has actually decreased in 2022, as we can see from the figure below. India's public debt is high, but given that India has a very low share of external debt in its portfolio of public debt, and given that the rate of growth is expected to outstrip the rate of interest quite handsomely, we do not foresee any sustainability issues on the debt front. So fiscal policy has been prudent, but through efficient targeting, it has been able to deliver a lot, cushioning much of the impact of the pandemic. Now, before we come to the outlook, can we go to the next slide? One issue that I'd like to talk about is India's financial sector. And this is a legacy issue in the sense that you must have heard or read that India's growth was slowing even before the COVID pandemic started. And that was partly because of what we call the twin balance sheet problem, which had its roots during the global financial crisis of 2008, which was led by a private investment boom and which was financed by the public sector banks. Now, after the global financial crisis hit, a lot of these projects, private sector projects, went bad. And once the revenue stream dried up on them, corporate debt started to increase, which was then reflected in non-performing assets in the public sector banks. So if you look at the first diagram on the top panel, you can see that the non-performing assets of public sector banks in particular started rising 2015, 2016 onwards, partly because recognition of these assets occurred a bit late after the RBI did a comprehensive asset quality review in 2016. Now, that kind of led to a lot of financial sector difficulties in the sense that once public sector bank balance sheets were burdened with non-performing assets, they kind of stopped lending to industries in particular. So the chart on the top, the second panel, you can see that lending to industries after April 2016 basically went down to zero. And reflecting this in a way and this is an issue that we are watching quite closely, is India's private investment to GDP share has been constantly declining from the from the last decade. It has actually declined by about 8 percentage points between 2008 and 2021. And that is an area that needs work, and the government is trying to address through various measures. But the good thing that has happened, and again, if you look at the first chart on the top panel, non-performing assets in the banking system have started to decline because a lot of cleanup of the banking system has happened. So that should augur well for private investment going forward. But having said that, this decline in NPS have happened in the milieu of low investment and low exposure. So the chart on the top still shows that share of large borrowers in the gross non-performing assets ratio is quite high. It's still above 60%. And there is still a bit of resolution that needs to be done before we can say that a comprehensive exit from the twin balance sheet problem has been achieved. And as the RBI has flagged in recent months, some stress in the non-banking segments of the financial sector have arisen because the impact of COVID was more on the non-banking and the informal sectors of the economy. And regulatory forbearance was extended to help them tide over the impact of the pandemic. But some such forbearance is still continuing. So once the forbearance is withdrawn, we may see some stress, even though they might not be systemic, developing in the non-banking segments. So a lot of good things happening in the financial sector, but some red flags do exist. Slide. So would you like to do this? Okay, so now we would like to sum up what we have presented. So there are two main themes when we look at the growth prospects going forward, and especially for FY23. High inflation. We understand that high inflation is here to stay. It's not going to be a transitory phenomenon contributed by unfortunate events in Ukraine, which makes monetary policy much more tighter. And the government has been very cautious about fiscal spending. So kind of very constrained policy support at a phase when the economy was just about recovering, coupled with the fact that the pandemic has had some lasting impacts on some sections of the economy. For example, on private consumption, we have seen that private consumption, which is 60% of India's economy, has been gradual to recover. And both inflation and heightened uncertainty will keep it gradual. So that has led us to downsize India's growth projections for FY23. We are roughly currently in the 7 to 7.5 range. And we have to actually observe the situation very closely when we come up with our forecasts again in October. Of course, the current account deficit will widen because the trade deficit, as my colleague Dhruv was showing, is widening. And while imports have rebounded very strongly, a weaker global outlook would also mean that export growth will not be as anticipated. The general government deficit is likely to fall in FY23. Remember the chart that I showed, that public debt, even though it is sustainable, still remains very high. And therefore, there is actually not much fiscal space that the government can now use to extend further stimulus. Finally, we have seen a strong recovery so far from the pandemic, but elevated global oil prices, supply disruptions, which again have proved to be more persistent than earlier believed, and rising food prices. All these will not make inflation a transitory phenomenon. Inflation has been above the RBI's target range for many months now, and the RBI has actually now started to increase the policy rate quite aggressively. Finally, and this links to what I said about the financial sector, we do see some pickup in bank credit and some pickup in private investment so far. But unless financial sector reforms are seen through their logical conclusion, so the government has taken various measures to strengthen the financial sector and prevent the reemergence of NPAs, especially in public sector banks. However, those reforms uh, will, if followed through to their full mandate, will strengthen resilience. But we perhaps have to wait a bit longer to see a more durable uptick in private investment. And currently, as I said, the government's focus is more on capital spending, so that will surely help to crowd in a lot of private investment. That, in sum, is India's outlook. We thank you for listening to us patiently. Questions are welcome.
Thank you for the informative presentation, Mr. Sharma and Mr. Ghosh. And I would like to thank the three speakers again for their insightful presentations. And I think they were beneficial for all of us joining today, spreading knowledge and stimulating new ideas. Now, I would like to open the floor for discussion, and questions from both Zoom and YouTube will be discussed. And to ask a question, please use raise hand icon in the Zoom or use the chat room. And please state your name and affiliation along with your question. So there was one question. We have one question collected earlier, and the question was, the actual development problem in India is the ever increasing gap between the rich and the poor population in metro cities. Since a huge part of sustainable development and development cooperation deals with inclusiveness, what could be some strategies that can reduce this gap in order to make sure that development occurs in all areas and sectors of a society? Can Mr. Sharma and Mr. Ghosh answer this question?
We can certainly make an attempt to answer a question. It's a very important question, but it's a difficult one to provide a single answer to. We did see that over the past couple of years, a lot of a non-trivial part of the progress that India had made in reducing inequality, in reducing poverty. Some part of that had been reversed as a result of the pandemic. The extent to which that reversal is permanent is still yet to be seen. I'm sure everyone is familiar with pictures of many sort of workers who were in urban areas who had migrated back to rural areas. That's something that that's a phenomenon that was something that we have been following, and something that we're trying to analyze in order for us to come up with good policy suggestions. I don't want to necessarily highlight that as a reason why India will not progress, because a lot of the responses that Rangeet and I mentioned were aimed and are continuing to be targeted to those who are most vulnerable. A lot of the support that was extended was targeted because there was a perception that the slowdown in economic activity, the slowdown in development was largely a supply side problem, and once restrictions to economic activity, once restrictions to mobility were removed, then India's economy would bounce back, and we are seeing that happen. So I think it's important that policymakers continue the reform, the efforts that we saw over the past couple of years with the provision of I'll give two examples, with the provision of welfare assistance through various schemes. There was a scheme to provide food rations. There was a scheme that provided monetary cash transfers. to the poorest in India. And there was also a shift towards having portability when it comes to access to these benefits, so that the benefits that people could and households could receive were not tied to their home location. So this is the One Ration, One Nation initiative. And I think that will go a long way in addressing some of the challenges that we saw over the past couple of years, and will go some way in also perhaps reducing the extent to which reducing the extent to which the pandemic has had an effect in setting or slowing India's progress in reducing inequality and boosting shared prosperity as well. A lot of significant development was made in financial inclusion as well over the past couple of years. The whole world saw a shift in the way services are delivered. We saw references to telehealth. Similar developments in the financial sector, which will go some way in improving financial inclusion, will help those as well. Rangi, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add that, India's economy is largely large swathes of informal sector. So one way to reduce inequality is to create very good quality jobs which pay well and which come with social security benefits in the formal sector. So that's challenge number one. And that will have to include the structural transformation. So still a substantial portion of the population is in agriculture. So they have to migrate to industry and services. That's one. Second is India also has a lot of unskilled labor, and India's services-led growth has meant that that pool of unskilled labor has not been fully utilized and brought into the growth story. So one way to achieve that is for India to be part of global value chains in trade, which the government of India is trying. But there are aspects of trade policy which we need to go deeper for a full discussion. But if India is part of global value chains, it can specialize in products which uses the unskilled labor, create jobs for them, and thus raise incomes in sections which have been left behind so far. So that, in a nutshell, is what we think is needed.
Thank you for sharing your comments, Mr. Sharma and Mr. Ghosh. And Ms. Iqbal, do you want to add your comments in regards to the health sector? Can you unmute your mic? Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think India is doing a good job. So as I discussed about the telemedicine, it is across India, not only metro cities. So India has created telemedicine hubs across 50 of the medical colleges that provide necessary knowledge network to leverage the technology. Plus it has strengthened the infrastructure like satellite communications so that it is able to reach all the places, even hard to reach places. And India, with its diverse landscape, needed a solution to that effect. I think in that area aspects, India is doing a good and equitable distribution of healthcare access to hard to reach places, both in metro and rural setups. That is all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Iqbal, for sharing your comments. And for timekeeping purposes, if there isn't any further more questions or comments, I would like to wrap up the Q&A session here. So ladies and gentlemen, this marks the end of the 4th Development Talks webinar on India. Thank you again for all of your enthusiastic participation, and I hope all of you had a fruitful experience from this webinar. Before you leave, please kindly note that participation survey will be emailed to you soon, and we would appreciate it if you could take a short time to complete the survey for us to provide improved webinars in the future. I hope to see you again at our next event soon, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.